Welcome to the Global Risk Podcast from Solace Global. This is your weekly global intelligence briefing, covering the key geopolitical and security developments shaping the world. In the Americas, we assess U.S. Senate efforts to limit President Trump's unilateral authority on Venezuela, which are unlikely to alter Washington's current strategy, and renewed unrest risks in Bolivia, despite the repeal of a controversial fuel decree. Across Europe, the Middle East and Africa, we examine Russia's use of the Oreshnik missile against Ukraine amid large-scale strikes on energy infrastructure during a severe cold snap, growing uncertainty around the second stage of the Gaza peace plan, the U.S. redeployment of a carrier strike group in response to deadly protests in Iran, and the heightened risk of unrest in Uganda as the country votes under an internet shutdown. And in Asia-Pacific, we cover escalating violence around Myanmar's general elections and coordinated bomb and arson attacks targeting petrol stations in Thailand's deep south ahead of national polls. Expert insight, clear analysis, and the context you need, all in one concise briefing. We begin in the Americas, where the U.S. Senate has advanced a largely symbolic resolution aimed at limiting President Trump's ability to conduct further unilateral action against Venezuela. On January 8th, the Senate advanced a war powers resolution that would restrict the president's ability to pursue additional military action without explicit congressional approval, following the operation that led to the capture of President Maduro. The vote passed 52 to 47, with 5 Republicans joining all Democrats in support. This was only a procedural vote and largely symbolic, but it has been widely interpreted as a formal rebuke of the president's unilateral move. Its passage ensures the Senate will now hold a final vote on the resolution. However, even if that vote succeeds, the measure would still require approval in the Republican-controlled House of Representatives before being sent to President Trump, who is expected to veto it. Overriding a presidential veto would require a two-thirds majority in both the House and the Senate. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The bipartisan vote in the Senate has likely served as an official reproach of President Trump, signaling congressional disapproval of the administration's unilateral military actions in Venezuela. However, the resolution's chances of becoming law remain low, as it is highly unlikely that both houses could secure the two-thirds majority needed to overturn a presidential veto. Even in the unlikely event that the resolution does pass, it would probably have little practical effect on current U.S. strategy toward Venezuela. The capture of President Maduro has significantly reduced the likelihood of further direct military action on Venezuelan soil, barring a major escalation. The Trump administration's strategy is increasingly centered on economic and maritime coercion. U.S. Southern Command has continued targeting vessels allegedly involved in narcotics smuggling and, more significantly, has now seized 8 oil tankers suspected of belonging to Venezuela's so-called dark fleet. This activity is likely to expand, as Washington has recently filed for court warrants to seize dozens more tankers linked to the Venezuelan oil trade. The exact number remains unclear, as the filings and legal orders are not public. The resolution is also unlikely to affect U.S. seizures of tankers or interdictions of narcotics-linked vessels in international waters, as these actions do not constitute hostilities against a sovereign state. Venezuelan-linked oil tankers have operated under false flags and opaque ownership structures, further diluting any formal attribution to Venezuela. Moreover, neither the seizure of oil tankers nor operations targeting narcotics smuggling vessels fall under war powers authorities. They are carried out under separate law enforcement or sanctions frameworks. Sustained maritime pressure on Caracas is likely to push the new Venezuelan administration towards concessions aimed at securing economic relief. Caracas has already released hundreds of political prisoners, including U.S. citizens, and has redirected sanctioned crude exports back towards the U.S. market. It has granted licensed access to U.S. firms and is allowing oil revenues to be handled under U.S. oversight. This shift has already led to a marked decline in Venezuelan oil exports to China. Two Chinese-flagged supertankers that were en route to collect debt repayment crude were forced to turn back because of the de facto U.S. embargo. Taken together, these developments suggest that Washington's immediate strategy is based on negotiated compliance rather than full regime change. Staying in the region, we move to Bolivia, where protests and roadblocks are likely to continue despite the government's decision to repeal a controversial fuel decree. On January 11th, President Paz agreed to repeal Decree 5503, which had been introduced on December 17, 2025, and triggered almost immediate nationwide protests after it removed government fuel subsidies, effectively doubling the price of petrol and diesel. In response to the repeal, the Bolivian Workers' Center, the country's largest union, announced an end to its national strike and protest mobilization. On January 12th, the Unified Syndical Confederation of Peasant Workers of Bolivia also instructed its members to lift all road blockades. In place of Decree 5503, the government of President Rodrigo Paz Pereira has enacted Supreme Decree 5516, a 32-article transitional measure that replaces key elements of the previous economic package. The new decree introduces expanded social protection, a range of economic support measures, wage increases, and several other provisions aimed at appeasing the unions. However, it does not reinstate fuel subsidies. The revised fuel pricing regime remains in force. Now our assessment. While the repeal of Decree 5503 has been welcomed by several major trade union groups, roadblocks have continued in parts of the country, particularly in Cochabamba Department. This area is a traditional stronghold of the movement for socialism and home to many indigenous communities. The continued unrest is likely driven by the government's refusal to reinstate fuel subsidies. That decision has exacerbated the cost of living crisis, especially in rural areas where communities rely heavily on fuel for transport and agriculture. It may also encourage transport unions to sustain their protests. More radical unions and protest movements have already rejected the reforms, arguing that they do not offset the inflationary pressures created by the suspension of fuel subsidies. Sustained protests and roadblocks are likely to be most active in the Cochabamba Department, a traditional hub for unions and indigenous groups. It is also a long-standing stronghold of the movement for socialism, which originally introduced the fuel subsidies and remains firmly opposed to the new right-leaning government. Although this is only one department, Cochabamba sits at a geographic choke point at the center of Bolivia's road network. It links the political center of La Paz and El Alto with the economic center of Santa Cruz and connects the Western Highlands with the Eastern Lowlands. Even if protests subside elsewhere, large-scale disruptions in Cochabamba can interrupt national transport corridors and generate countrywide effects, including shortages, supply chain disruption, and inflationary pressures. Bolivia has experienced at least 4 major waves of nationwide protests and roadblocks over the past 5 years, each bringing disruption, widespread violence, and periods of prolonged economic and political instability. The effectiveness of mass mobilization and transport blockades in shaping government policy suggests that these tactics are becoming firmly established tools for both the opposition and the unions. With President Paz poised to reverse many decisions made by previous left-wing governments and seeking to reduce the fiscal deficit, it is highly likely that similar large-scale protest movements will be deployed in response to future reform measures introduced by the new right-wing administration. Now turning to Europe, the Middle East and Africa, where Russia has used the Oreshnik missile against Ukraine alongside sustained strikes on energy infrastructure during a severe winter cold snap. Overnight on January 8th and 9th, Russian forces carried out large-scale strikes across Ukraine, with Kyiv Oblast the primary target. The combined strike package involved 36 missiles and 242 one-way attack drones and decoys. Notably, the attack included the use of an Oreshnik intermediate-range ballistic missile. Footage suggests it targeted the Lviv State Aircraft Repair Plant in Lviv City and likely carried dummy warheads that still reached hypersonic speed and generated significant kinetic energy. In Kyiv, the strikes resulted in at least 4 deaths and widespread energy outages. Ukraine's largest private energy company, DTEK, reported that 417,000 households were disconnected from electricity. Kyiv's mayor, Vitaly Klitschko, said nearly half of the city's apartment buildings were left without heating. Some of the worst-hit neighborhoods were reportedly without power for 3 consecutive days. Overnight on January 12th and 13th, Russian forces launched the largest combined strike package of the new year so far, with roughly 300 attack drones and 25 missiles targeting 8 Ukrainian regions. The main targets were energy generation facilities and substations. Emergency power cuts were reported in Kyiv, as well as in the Chernihiv, Odessa, Kharkiv, Dnipropetrovsk, Zaporizhzhia, and Donetsk regions. DTEK stated that the attack heavily damaged equipment at a thermal power plant in Odessa city, leaving 46,000 households without electricity. The CEO of the state-owned transmission system operator Ukrenergo reported that around 70% of Kyiv city was left without power. Overnight on January 13th and 14th, Russian forces carried out another wave of strikes, using 3 missiles and 113 attack drones and decoys, with Kryvyi Rih particularly affected. Local authorities reported that 45,000 customers were temporarily cut off from power, and 700 buildings were disconnected from heating. Now, our team's assessment: the Russian Ministry of Defense claims that the use of the Oreshnik missile was a response to an alleged Ukrainian attempt to attack President Vladimir Putin's residence on December 29th. There is no verified evidence that such an attack occurred. The highly likely falsely alleged strike on the presidential residence was almost certainly used by the Kremlin to try to undermine progress in Ukraine's negotiations with its allies, which at the time included the strongest security guarantees yet proposed for Ukraine. The Oreshnik IRBM, which entered service in 2024, carries multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles. It is exceptionally difficult to intercept as it travels through the upper atmosphere, and its MIRVs can each reach hypersonic speeds once the missile re-enters the Earth's atmosphere. While other Russian missiles regularly used against Ukraine can be nuclear-armed, such as the Iskander-M and the KH-101, the Oreshnik almost certainly carries a far stronger implied nuclear threat. Its MIRVs were developed specifically for nuclear deterrence, giving the system a heightened symbolic significance when deployed. The first use of Oreshnik occurred in November 2024, again with dummy warheads, and was accompanied by Putin's claim that the strike was a response to Ukraine being permitted to use Western-supplied ATACMS and Storm Shadow missiles against targets inside Russian territory. Using Oreshnik with dummy warheads delivers only a limited kinetic effect and at very high cost. However, the Kremlin almost certainly employs the system as a tool of symbolic deterrence, signaling an implied nuclear threat without resorting to a tactical nuclear strike. Its recent use followed the coalition of the Willing Paris Summit, as well as the U.S. seizure of a Venezuela-linked Russian-flagged oil tanker, and is likely connected to these developments. The decision to target Lviv in western Ukraine, just 50 kilometers from the Polish border, was also likely deliberate. It sends a pointed message of deterrence to Ukraine's allies. On the ground in Ukraine, the most critical effect of the past week's large-scale Russian strikes has been the damage inflicted on energy infrastructure, coinciding with a cold snap that has pushed nighttime temperatures as low as -19 degrees Celsius. Ukrainian air defense is almost certainly struggling to intercept these combined strike packages, particularly ballistic missiles. During the January 12th to 13th attack, Russian forces launched 18 Iskander-M ballistic missiles and S-300 air defense missiles used in a surface-to-surface role, along with 7 Iskander-K cruise missiles. only 2 of the Iskander-M and S-300 missiles were intercepted, compared with 5 of the Iskander-Ks. As outages continue, many Ukrainians are relying on backup generators and portable gas stoves for heating. However, while Russian forces have routinely intensified strikes on Ukrainian energy infrastructure in the run-up to and during winter since 2022, the current sustained campaign almost certainly presents the most severe challenge to date. Freezing temperatures and a lack of heating for several consecutive days raise the risk of a humanitarian catastrophe in cities. Mayor Vitaly Klitschko has urged residents who are able to leave temporarily for places with reliable power and heat to do so. The Russian campaign against Ukraine's energy network is highly likely intended to break civilian morale and to prompt an exodus from Kiev. From there, we look at Gaza, where the second stage of the ceasefire plan is beginning amid uncertainty over Hamas's willingness to disarm. On January 14th, U.S. officials announced the start of Phase 2 of the peace deal between Israel and the Palestinian militant groups in the Gaza Strip. During the first phase, Hamas released the remaining living hostages, along with the remains of those who died in captivity. Israel Defense Forces units withdrew from some positions in Gaza and allowed a sharp increase in the entry of aid. The second stage aims to demilitarize the Gaza Strip, disarm Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups, and begin the transition to a civilian administration, coordinated through the Civil Military Coordination Center. On the eve of the announcement, international media reported that Hamas has begun internal debates to elect a new political chairman, the first leadership contest since Yahya Sinwar was killed in Rafah in October 2024. According to observers, the 2 leading candidates, Khalil al-Hayya and Khaled Meshal, are both based in Qatar. Now our intelligence assessment. The second stage of the ceasefire is likely to face significant difficulties. Hamas has almost certainly been severely weakened by more than 2 years of conflict. Even so, it has continued efforts to rearm and to replenish its ranks with new recruits from the civilian population. Despite its stated openness to the peace plan, Hamas almost certainly retains a core interest in remaining the dominant power in the Gaza Strip. Recent incidents, including the January 12th ambush of a Hamas police chief in the southern Gaza Strip, reportedly carried out by a rival clan, are likely to reinforce the group's reluctance to disarm completely. Moreover, despite the ceasefire, Israeli forces continue to strike suspected militant infrastructure, and both sides frequently report violations that result in casualties. According to the Gaza Health Ministry, at least 450 people have been killed during military operations since the ceasefire began, and more than 1,200 have been wounded. The choice of Hamas's next chairman is likely to offer an important signal about the group's strategic priorities. Khaled Meshal is widely viewed as a pragmatist with deep ties to regional Sunni powers. He is also not a native of Gaza and has never lived in the Gaza Strip. By contrast, Khalil al-Hayya maintains positive relations with other Palestinian factions and with Iran. Staying in the region in Iran, widespread anti-government protests have prompted the United States to redeploy a carrier strike group to the Middle East. The protests, which began in late December 2025, have escalated into one of the deadliest nationwide crackdowns in years. Activist groups report thousands of protesters killed and more than 18,000 detained. Current death toll estimates range from over 2,000 to as high as 12,000. Though the accurate flow of information out of Iran is severely constrained by the regime's suspension of internet access, the jamming of satellite communications, and strict controls on foreign media. U.S. President Donald Trump has issued multiple warnings to Iran in response to the killing or potential execution of protesters, stating that the U.S. is locked and loaded and ready to go, though he has avoided specifying what action might follow. On January 15th, the Pentagon ordered the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group to redeploy to the Middle East from the South China Sea, and both the US and the UK have carried out a limited withdrawal of personnel from Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. Tehran has threatened retaliation against US and Israeli interests if it is attacked, and has warned that it could launch preemptive strikes on US regional bases. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. President Trump has repeatedly warned Iran against the killing or execution of protesters and has signaled a willingness to use direct military action. However, as of January 15th, the US likely does not have the necessary military assets in theater to ensure both an effective large-scale strike capability and credible deterrence. Although the US maintains multiple air bases across the Middle East, these installations are fixed and vulnerable, and would almost certainly be exposed to Iranian missile, drone, and proxy attacks in the event of escalation. Crucially, Washington also depends on permission from its Arab partners to operate from regional bases in an offensive capacity. While many of these partners would likely welcome regime change in Iran, they are unlikely to authorize the use of their territory for direct strikes over what remains an internal Iranian issue, given the risks of retaliation and potential domestic backlash. During the June 2025 12-day war between Iran and Israel, when the US bombed Iran's nuclear program, Washington had 3 carrier strike groups within range of Iran. At present, it has none in theater, with the closest being the USS Abraham Lincoln in the South China Sea. The redeployment of the Abraham Lincoln CSG, which includes 3 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers armed with a range of offensive and defensive systems, including Tomahawk land attack cruise missiles, will almost certainly strengthen Washington's strike and deterrence capability, while increasing the credibility and likelihood of US military action. However, the redeployment will take several days, and Washington may prefer to have at least 2 carrier strike groups in theater before committing to direct military action. The future movement of additional US carrier groups into the region would be a stronger indicator and warning of impending US military action, substantially increasing the credibility of US threats. Moreover, an attack on the Iranian regime itself, rather than on its nuclear program, would likely be viewed in Tehran as an existential threat. Such a strike would almost certainly prompt major retaliation and raise the risk of a regional escalation. Any escalation could also jeopardize the current Gaza peace plan, which remains one of President Trump's key foreign policy priorities. President Trump has since stated publicly that the violence in Iran has stopped, and that Iranian sources have indicated the execution of protesters will not go ahead. This may be an early sign that the administration is seeking to de-escalate and avoid immediate military action in favor of non-kinetic options. In Iran, the protests have almost certainly been viewed by the regime as a genuine threat. The scale of the crackdown, marked by unprecedented levels of lethal force and mass arrests, has produced death tolls that exceed those of the 2019 and 2022-23 protests, and in a far shorter time frame. Internal sources suggest that this has enabled the authorities to reassert control over major urban areas, leading to a decline in large-scale street demonstrations. There is a realistic possibility that protest activity will now shift towards more decentralized, low-visibility forms of resistance, resulting in lower death tolls and reducing the likelihood of direct US intervention. And in East Africa, Uganda is voting in a tightly contested election under a nationwide internet shutdown, increasing the likelihood of post-election unrest. On January 13th, 2 days before the January 15th general election, Uganda's Communications Authority ordered all service providers to suspend internet access. The decision was justified on public safety grounds, with officials claiming the measure was needed to prevent online misinformation, disinformation, and electoral fraud, as well as the incitement of violence. The move followed an earlier statement from the Uganda Communications Commission insisting that speculation about an impending shutdown was mere rumors. Polling remains extremely close between incumbent President Yoweri Museveni of the National Resistance Movement and his main challenger, Robert Sentamu, better known as Bobi Wine, of the National Unity Platform. A survey of 34,000 people conducted on January 2nd placed Museveni at 39.9%, narrowly ahead of Wine at 39.8%, a margin of just 0.1 percentage point. However, the elections have been widely criticized as neither free nor fair, with conditions heavily weighted in favor of Museveni securing a seventh term in office. As of the morning of January 15th, many polling stations failed to open on time, despite voting being scheduled to begin at 7 a.m. local time. Officials have blamed the delays on failures in biometric identification kits, as well as the nationwide internet shutdown. These issues are reportedly affecting both pro-government and opposition strongholds. Now our assessment. Cutting the internet has been used repeatedly in Uganda during elections or periods of heightened tension. During the 2021 general elections, for example, access was suspended for more than a week amid widespread civil unrest. The latest shutdown has almost certainly been imposed preemptively to prevent the circulation of footage showing security forces using excessive force, to constrain the spread of anti-government sentiment, and to inhibit the organization of mass rallies on social media. Major youth protests have erupted in recent years in neighboring Tanzania and Kenya, as well as in a number of other African countries, including Morocco, Madagascar, and Angola. In each case, protesters relied on the internet to varying degrees to organize large-scale nationwide demonstrations against their governments. Museveni's administration has almost certainly taken note of these movements and is highly likely hoping that restricting internet access will stem the spread of anti-government sentiment. In the background of the election are expectations that President Museveni's son, Muhoozi Kainerugaba, will assume the presidency should the 81-year-old leader fail to complete his term. Kainerugaba is a four-star general and a top military commander, overseeing Uganda's most powerful institution. Critics of Museveni have even urged him to carry out a military coup to remove his father from power. Kainerugaba has previously threatened to behead Bobi Wine and has called for him to be hanged. Wine, for his part, has accused the army, which Kainerugaba effectively controls, of having largely taken over the election and of inflicting violence on his supporters. Kainerugaba's dominance of the military almost certainly heightens the risk of a coup if major nationwide unrest breaks out or, in the unlikely event, if Wine wins the presidency. Widespread youth frustration persists in Uganda, and protests are likely if Museveni is re-elected, or if footage of security forces using excessive force begins circulating widely once internet access is restored. If civil unrest breaks out, demonstrations are likely to concentrate around the central business district and near key government buildings. During the brief anti-corruption protests in July 2024, for example, groups marched through Kampala towards the Parliament building before being blocked by security forces. Large anti-government protests would almost certainly disrupt travel, with security forces likely to establish roadblocks to prevent protesters from approaching government buildings and diplomatic zones. Now shifting to Asia-Pacific, further attacks on polling stations and local officials are likely as Myanmar's general elections move into their next phase. On January 11th, the second phase of Myanmar's three-stage general elections took place across 100 of the country's 330 townships, including parts of the Sagaing, Magwe, Mandalay, Bago, and Taninthari regions. Voting was held in schools and in government and religious buildings. The first phase took place on December 28th in 102 townships, and the final round is scheduled for January 25th. 65 townships will not participate due to ongoing clashes. Reports of voter intimidation have emerged. A resident of Kamu Township said that security forces were shouting with mics and shouting repeatedly until 12 noon to ask everyone who has a ballot list to come to the polling station without fail. A resident of Pasantong Township reported similar calls to vote. Multiple ethnic armed organizations and People's Defense Forces, anti-junta militias aligned with the National Unity Government, have publicly opposed the election and threatened to disrupt polling. These groups carried out numerous attacks on the day of voting. Explosions were reported at 2 polling stations in Minhla Township, while further blasts and exchanges of gunfire occurred in Yi District. No injuries were reported in either location. A drone attack targeted an election administration office in Tantabin Township in Bago Region, killing 1 official and injuring another, which forced the closure of the local polling station. In the Magwe region, a local administrator was shot and killed after inspecting polling stations. Now our team's assessment. The Tatmadaw reported a 52% turnout in the first phase, although the real figure is likely lower despite widespread voter intimidation. Most citizens almost certainly view the election as neither free nor fair. The pro-Tatmadaw Union Solidarity and Development Party has been declared the victor of the first phase, winning 89 of the 102 seats. It is highly likely to be declared the overwhelming winner of the second phase as well. The ongoing elections have been widely criticized by numerous bodies, including the UN and several human rights organizations, as a sham intended to bolster the ruling military junta's image. In the lead-up to the vote, the junta has sharply restricted freedom of expression, with more than 200 people arrested under measures that allow protests or criticism of the polls to be punished with jail sentences of up to 10 years. Several opposition parties have also been barred from taking part. Given the scale of the repression, the elections are highly unlikely to secure broad international recognition and almost certainly amount to a formality. The first round of voting also saw attacks on polling stations by ethnic armed organizations and People's Defense Forces. These incidents have almost certainly been intended to damage infrastructure or target local officials rather than civilians, which has limited their scale. Although the attacks have not significantly disrupted the conduct of the elections, many citizens have likely avoided traveling to polling stations for fear of being caught in conflict-related violence. Further attacks on the final day of polling are highly likely. And finally, in the region, coordinated bomb and arson attacks targeting petrol stations in Thailand's deep south are consistent with insurgent activity ahead of the February general election. On January 11th, around midnight, a series of coordinated bomb and arson attacks struck PTT petrol stations across the Deep South. 5 sites were hit in Narathiwat Province, 2 in Pattani Province, and 4 in Yala Province. The explosions injured at least 4 people, including a police officer, and caused significant property damage. Authorities have increased security, tightened patrols, and imposed a curfew in Narathiwat Province in response. Investigations are underway to identify the perpetrators, and officials have urged the public to avoid high-risk areas and follow official updates closely. Now our intelligence assessment. The attacks were geographically dispersed within each affected province, likely indicating a deliberate effort to maximize disruption, to fuel infrastructure, stretch the resources of the authorities, and increase publicity. The timing of the incidents also suggests an intent to minimize civilian casualties. No group has yet claimed responsibility. However, the scale, coordination, and choice of targets are consistent with the operational patterns of established insurgent groups, such as the Barisan Revolusi Nasional, the principal Malay Muslim separatist movement active in Thailand's deep south. Smaller or less established splinter groups are unlikely to possess the logistical networks, command and control structures, or regional reach needed to carry out near-simultaneous attacks across multiple provinces. While attacks involving improvised explosive devices or arson are relatively common in Thailand's deep south, the nature of these incidents, targeting infrastructure at night, likely indicates that they were intended as strategic messaging to undermine public confidence rather than to cause mass casualties. Despite Thailand's intermittent border tensions with Cambodia, there is no credible evidence that the Thai military has diverted resources away from the Deep South to reinforce the Cambodian border. Nor has there been any escalatory increase in troop deployments to the region. These would be developments that insurgent groups might, in theory, seek to exploit. Thailand is scheduled to hold general elections on February 8th, following the dissolution of parliament in December. Insurgents in the Deep South have traditionally escalated attacks during electoral cycles to undermine the central government and maximize publicity. In 2023, for instance, insurgents set fire to mobile phone towers and tires across Yala, Patani, and Narathiwat provinces. During the 2011 and 2014 election periods, militant activity also increased around polling and campaigning, with attacks on infrastructure, local officials, and security forces. Given the forthcoming February election and this consistent historical pattern, further low-level and coordinated attacks are likely in the run-up. There is also a realistic possibility that more hardline elements of the insurgency will attempt more lethal attacks on both civilian and security targets. That concludes this week's Global Intelligence Briefing. These updates are part of our Global Intelligence subscription, which includes weekly reports, in-depth briefings, and live Q&A sessions with our experts. To learn more, visit solaceglobal.com. Thank you for listening.